go. Well, Dr. Wolf wrote the book on it, which she'll talk about. So I will turn it over to her.
That yep, you can hear me now? Okay, is the mic on? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so my book that Justin held up is, and this was published in 2020, came out in March 2020. A great time to have your book tour canceled, right? It wasn't really a book tour, but anyway, close as you get for a Bible scholar. And this is a Bible commentary series. So a Bible commentary is this strange genre that we use in biblical studies and in theology and for clergy, that where, as my son, who was, 12 at the time when I described the project to him, he said, "Oh, so it's a book about a book." That's what a Bible commentary is, yes. So, but this wisdom commentary series, so there's a whole, several bookshelves worth that all have the same cover with different titles. So there's a volume per book of the Bible. A few of them are grouped together in a volume. And they are all from a feminist perspective, particularly. So it is a groundbreaking project by Liturgical Press, which is a Catholic publishing house, interestingly. And they launched this, boy, it's got to be more than 10, 15 years ago. And we're still seeing some volumes that are coming out. The series is not yet complete. Many of the authors are still writing. So this is one of many volumes from that series. And so this is a book about a book from a feminist perspective. Now, if you haven't already read Ecclesiastes, when you do, I hope you will, you okay. It's not that long, and I gave you a little syllabus. I'll show it to you in a bit. So there's not a huge reading assignment, but one thing you might find is, wow, this would be an interesting book to write a feminist commentary on, and I did find that immediately. So Kohelet has often been referred, Kohelet, I didn't introduce you to that term yet, but the author of the book we refer to as Kohelet, the Hebrew name for the book. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But this author has often been referred to as a blatant misogynist. And you'll see there, you'll find that part on your second week of reading. So the challenge for me is that a lot of the book does not explicitly discuss women. And so the task I put to myself is this: where are the women hiding in Ecclesiastes? And so that is the task I'm going to put to you all. So today I'm going to do some overview, intro stuff about the book of Ecclesiastes, and also kind of intro this topic. And then I'll give you some reading to do in the next couple of weeks. And hopefully one or two of you can agree to be kind of the note taker so that you can keep track of women that you find hiding in Ecclesiastes and also your questions. And then on the fourth week, the last Sunday of June, I will join you on virtually. I'll be so eager to hear, where did you find women and what questions did you have? And then we'll have a conversation that way. So that's our plan. I want to start out a little bit about how this book is used liturgically. So in Jewish tradition, this book is one of the Megillot, which are festival scrolls. A Megillah is a scroll. And so there are 5 scrolls, shorter books in the Hebrew Bible that are used for particular Jewish festivals. And so Ecclesiastes is used for the festival of Sukkot, which is in the fall. The date moves around because the Jewish calendar is different than the one that we typically use. You can kind of see, this is a picture from Temple B'nai Israel in Oklahoma City, and my friend Rabbi Vered Harris there on the right, and the Summer in the middle with the guitar. And up above, you can kind of see the roof. They are in a temporary dwelling called a sukkah. And so during Sukkot, Jewish communities and families build these temporary dwellings. And you're supposed to spend as much time in it as you can to study, especially to discuss. Some people eat and sleep in it. And I've heard if you're in certain parts of New York, Brooklyn, and so forth, you'll see people even have a little sukkah on their balcony in order to observe that festival in the city. The Sukkot is a kind of a harvest festival, and the ways that Ecclesiastes relates to that are maybe a bit obscure, but sort of reflection on time passing and gratitude for what one has, but also self-reflection and so forth. Now, in Christian liturgical context, we tend to see Ecclesiastes mainly used for funerals and sometimes for weddings. But also in the Wesleyan tradition. The university where I teach is affiliated with the United Methodist Church, so I have to be up on my Wesleyan stuff. And in John Wesley's liturgies, he used Ecclesiastes in the New Year's Day liturgy, which I'm guessing not very many of us are familiar with using it. So really the upshot here is that it tends to not get used much in Christian tradition. So yay that it's your favorite book, but it does get missed a lot. All right, so I just want to start by getting you all to talk a little bit. So somebody's doing the microphone. I want to know, what do you know about Ecclesiastes? We got a hand over here. Oh.
We're having technical excitement.
No, we're not.
There we go.
Whose hand?
I know, if I remember right, I think it's considered a book of poetry within, I may be wrong on that, but of course there's that famous section about there's a time to be planted and a time to, from chapter 3. Which the Byrds sang because Pete Seeger wrote the lyrics to it.
Okay, great.
I mean the music to it, excuse me.
Okay. So chapter 3 has a poem in it. You said a book of poetry. Scholars would debate that a bit. There are parts of it that are more like prose and parts that are more like poetry. I personally think that the book is more poetry than how we usually see it portrayed in the translations. And when we have a translation, sometimes the translators will format the lines so that you look at it and you go, oh, that's a poem. That visual can give us that. But they don't always do that. And there are several parts of the book where I think they should do that and they don't. But chapter 3, you're right, is the most familiar. Does everybody know that song? The Byrds song, yes, which Pete Seeger wrote. And I have a video, but we couldn't get the sound to work. So you can look this up later on YouTube. It's so delightful. Young Judy Collins and young Pete Seeger. And Judy Collins sings it, and then he chimes in. It's very sweet. It very closely follows the King James Version, but he added, I swear it's not too late, after a time for peace, and that kind of helped make it a peace anthem. And that chapter, really that poem, that verse poem, 3:1 through 8, is the most well-known part of the book for most people that I've encountered. I happen to think that the author of the book lifted that poem and put it in, and then to me, the most important part are the verses that follow 3:1 to 8, where, in my interpretation, the author critiques the poem. So anytime anybody asks me to use the poem, I say, in a wedding or a funeral or something like that, I say, you just need to know that my view of how this poem is used here is that the author is critiquing it, and so I'm going to say a bit about that. So, go ahead.
Well, my professor, Leo Perdue, he always liked to play with this a lot with the opening, because I guess on the Hebrew you can play around with the translation, like vanity, vanity, all is vanity, or nothingness, nothingness, or meaningless. So it begins with a very cynical sort of thing about life, and I think throughout that, and often kind of meditate on that. So it's a different sort of thing in the wisdom literature, and also I found studying some of that, because we had to, in his class, look at the wisdom of Ptahhotep and some of the other wisdom literature, which to a 19-year-old seems like, yeah, why do I need to learn this stuff?
Well, okay, if you studied Kohel or Ecclesiastes with Leo Perdue, you've got some real cred. So thank you. That's great. And when you were 19, where was that? At Phillips. Okay. Yeah, I have another student in Oklahoma City who studied with Leo. We can talk about that later. But anyway, so we're going to talk about that. Yeah, the translation of the theme word in Ecclesiastes is a really important issue. And you mentioned cynical. So one of the things that's interesting about this book is that it is so wide open to interpretation. So what I encourage you to do is to read it and see what you think. How would you characterize this author? Would you say that this author is cynical or even optimistic? I mean, those are two ends of a wide spectrum. One of my professors, who Justin also studied with, Julie Duncan, and she also wrote a commentary on Ecclesiastes, which I have a little blurb on the back. It's a fantastic book. But she said to us in class that Ecclesiastes is a Rorschach test for the interpreter. In other words, anybody who says something, whatever you say about Ecclesiastes, you're probably saying more about yourself than you are, isn't that good, than you are about the book. So I like to keep that in mind, and I encourage you to be thinking about that as you read it, and then as you come back in the next couple of weeks to discuss it. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to, no, you don't need this on tape. I just wanted to say that I remember when Pete Seeger and Judy Collins sang that.
Do ya? Yeah. You remember when they sang it on TV. Yeah, there's some really great YouTube videos of Pete Seeger singing this. Yeah. So, and I always like to play the non-Birds version because that's the one that most people are familiar with. So I like to remind them, like, Pete Seeger wrote this. So anyway, and they have a cute little dialogue right at the beginning, so y'all can look that up easily enough on YouTube. Yes, so true. Okay, anything else? What do you know? What do you know already about Ecclesiastes? Nothing. Thank you. Actually, that's actually a good theme in the book. That's cool. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, and I mean, that aligns with what I said. It doesn't tend to get used much in Christian tradition or context, and as a Hebrew Bible scholar, of course, I'm always like borderline offended at how little churches do. Of course, this church accepted, of course, in general, on the Hebrew Bible versus the New Testament. You might have noticed the Hebrew Bible is actually longer. So, just saying. Anyway, hey, it's my career. So, anybody else? Anything you know? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, following on what Tim was saying, I remember that in the wisdom literature and Ecclesiastes in particular, that the images of God are very different than other places in the Hebrew scriptures, and that it has that either cynical or nothingness, just a different kind of God.
Okay, that's great. So we really want to pay attention to theology in this. And I'll talk a little bit about the wisdom literature in that context. But ask yourself, as you're studying this book, what does this book say about God? And remember, when you ask yourself this, and you may be well accustomed to this, but I often kind of visualize this for my students, like, take a little step back, and instead of saying, this is what God is like, because the book says so, say, this is what this book says that God is like, or this is what God is like for this author, because that's really where we get the richness of the theological images, the various theological descriptions in the whole canon, the Hebrew Bible and New Testament, is when we can really pay attention to where they are different. And when we're trying to say, here is the description of God or the theology in the whole Bible, then we're going to miss those really important variations by trying to make it a unified whole. So I really encourage people to look for, what is God like in this book? What does this author say that God is like? And notice those details. But yeah, we definitely have some uniqueness here in terms of theology. Any other questions, comments about what do you know about Ecclesiastes already? Okay, let's move on. All right, so I mentioned this word already, Kohelet. Say it with me. Kohelet. Kohelet. Now, you'll see, like on my book, I have it spelled with an H at the end. That's just because this is a word that's written in Hebrew letters. And when you take it, it sounds in Hebrew, it sounds like what we just said, Kohelet. You can write that many different ways in English. Sometimes people write it with a K. You've got the Q, which obviously breaks the rules of using Q in English, which is always supposed to be followed with a U. So these are just English letters that are supposed to represent Hebrew letters. And there are different traditions and conventions about how to do that. We call it transliteration. And one of them says that the final T sound on the end here has an H with it in order to represent that particular letter. And that's what my editor wanted, and so that's what I did on the book. But you typically don't pronounce it Koheleth. So traditionally, the book has been attributed to Solomon, and there are features of the book that give a nod to that. So the very opening verse says, the words of Kohelet, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So the son of David who was king in Jerusalem is Solomon. So there's that tradition, and frankly, that tradition of Solomonic authorship probably helped get the book into the canon, because the rabbis debated a lot about whether it should be included. But most scholars think, and we have good reason to think, that first verse was probably added later. We call it a superscription, kind of like the title page. And then there's also a kind of a epilogue at the end of the book in chapter 12, verses 9 through 14, where it suddenly is talking strictly about Kohelet in the third person. And so most scholars think those parts were added later. The language of the book, the Hebrew, is typical to a very late time period. So there are phrases and so forth used, and it's especially there's a relative pronoun used in this book that we don't see in earlier biblical literature. And so it does not fit the time of Solomon. But this was a very common thing with the biblical literature, that something would be written and it would be edited over time or attributed to a much earlier time. So there's a lot of literature that was written in the time in between the Testaments that got attributed to famous people, but clearly it wasn't written by them. So not Solomon. Now, a couple other things about Kohelet. This is a noun form of a verb. The verb is kahal. Kahal means to assemble a group. So who is a person who assembles a group? A teacher. So that's one common translation that we see for Kohelet, is a teacher. The German translations during the time of the Reformation also often called this book the preacher, der Prediger in German. I avoid that because it's so Christian, and this is not a Christian book. I mean, it is now too, but it was originally a Jewish book, and I really like to always emphasize that. So this is the name of the person or persona who is speaking, but it's also talks about what that person does. I like to think of this person as a philosopher, because since it's late biblical literature, it's probably from the time period a couple hundred years before Jesus, like 250 years BCE, before the Common Era, and that time period was very dominated by Greek thought. And so I think of this person as a philosopher, and I, consider that when you're reading it. Like, what does this sound like philosophy to me? Somebody doing a lot of self-reflection, a lot of questioning. So wisdom literature, as you mentioned already, the typical books that are included in the wisdom literature are Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes. And we'll talk a little bit about Proverbs today as background for Ecclesiastes. I always say Proverbs is your beginner level wisdom literature. And the wisdom literature this was common in, you mentioned Egyptian literature. This was a common part of ancient literature, that you would have learned people, we think they were mostly men, who would reflect on life and the deity or deities, depending on what culture it was, and how one should live, and they would ask lots of questions. And so if you look at Proverbs, there's your starting point. You go to Job. Job has a lot of questions about that body of thought. A distinguishing feature about the beginning level of wisdom literature is what we call retribution theology. The idea that the righteous are rewarded and the wicked are punished. It is a view that persists today, but I like to point out that Job and Ecclesiastes really had a lot of questions about that model, about that theology. So the context of wisdom literature is really important. Now, my colleagues in wisdom literature would want me to note that there are other parts of the Bible where we see wisdom thought. It's not just in those 3 books, but those are the easiest places to find it. So if you're really an overachiever, you should not only read Ecclesiastes, but also Proverbs, and maybe even Job, and look for some points of compare and contrast. Okay, so our 2 themes in the book. There are 2 themes. One is Hevel. Why don't you say that together? Hevel. This is a Hebrew word, and it literally means breath or puff of air. Bless you. And I've got a whole slide with various translations coming up. 38 times in the book. That's only 12 chapters. 38 times we see this book, often multiple times in one verse. So that is a major theme word. One of my doctoral advisors had suggested when we were discussing this that somewhere there's got to be an E.E. Cummings poem where he takes a word and uses it in a way that it gains its own meaning. And I think that might be what's going on here. The other theme in the book is seize the day, or in Latin, carpe diem. If you ever saw Dead Poets Society, you'll never forget Robin Williams' character telling the young men to seize the day, boys, because you will be food for worms. So 7 times in the book we see it. Usually how it appears here is some variation of eat and drink and enjoy your life. Yeah, exactly. So you can see that continuum, right, of optimist and cynic a little bit. One scholar many years ago wrote an article titled Kohelet, Preacher of Joy, and other scholars massively scoffed. So, but you can see with these two themes, now Hevel appears a lot more, but carpe diem, of course, that's usually 1 to 2 whole verses, and Hevel are single words. Also, 7-time repetition, of course. This is a really important number in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so let's look at some of those translations of Hevel. Often it's paired with and a striving after wind, which fits its literal meaning of breath or puff of air. I also think that there might be a little bit of onomatopoeia going on. Hevel. It's kind of a breathy word. Hevel.
Didn't that also kind of go with how you should pronounce Yahweh? It's very much of a breath.
Yes, yeah, at least in that incident, the burning bush scene where Adonai says, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, I will be who I will be. Yeah, so some of those same letters, yeah, that are kind of breathy.
Even kind of spiritual thing, too, like if you, depending on how you pronounce it, it's like breath, so it's the very first thing that comes out of the human being, and also the very last. And in a way, your beginning and ending begins with God.
Yeah, well, hand it to him anyway, because so you were saying breath is the first and the last thing, and everything begins with God. So there can be some kind of theological meaning here, but
Right.
also,
Right.
what are some other features of breath? If you think about that.
Yeah. It's like,
Okay,
so
But-
you can use it as even a
can you see it?
spirit.
Usually you cannot see it. It's invisible. Spirit. So the word ruach means spirit, but it also means breath. So that's a different word for breath, but there is a spirit aspect of that. Yeah. Anybody struggle with asthma or COPD or any other things where you struggle to get your breath? So there's this sense in which it's so important, it's crucial, but it's fleeting. You have to keep doing it all the time. All the time, you have to keep doing it. You're never done. You can't see it. It's insubstantial. You can't really hold it, unless you have a balloon, I guess. Yeah, or maybe I'm holding it, right? It's such an interesting abstract concept, if you think of it. So I gave you a whole bunch of, this is not even an exhaustive list. This is a shortened list. So the typical translation has been vanity. This comes from the Latin vanitas, and that I do not care for that translation, because in our time, a lot of people think of a vanity as a piece of furniture. Now, maybe you think of that, who was it? Carole King, "You're so vain." Carly Simon, thank you. There's a little of that, but that English word doesn't, I think, helpfully encompass what's going on in the Hebrew. The word I choose to use, the translation I base on the research of Michael V. Fox, who of blessed memory, who was a great professor of Kohelet at University of Wisconsin, and he used Camus' idea of the absurd and compared it to what he read in Kohelet. And Camus, Albert Camus, the French philosopher, described absurdity as when what you expect and what you get, they miss. And for me, that fits what I read in Kohelet. So I go with that. Now, there's this big debate that's gone on in the literature, in the scholarly literature. Am I supposed to stop at 11:45? 10 o'clock, okay, fantastic. There's this big debate in the scholarly literature between Michael V. Fox, well, he died recently, so I guess the debate will have to continue with someone else, and then Mark Sneed, who's my colleague down in Texas, Mark Sneed said, oh, absurd is anachronistic. That word is based on later ideas. And so he said it should be translated worthless. Go ahead.
The translations from breath to absurd, that's an odd connection, and I'm not sure what, I mean, I'm not arguing it, but it's just, that's totally, I mean, breath is not absurd, of course, by any stretch.
Okay, that's true. Nor is it worthless. Maybe it fits with one of the, I don't have it on here, but one of the translation uses the word fleeting.
Right.
Or I've seen sometimes ephemeral. Some translators like to use a different word to translate throughout, depending on how Hevel is used. Some translations, like the Message, uses smoke for each one. So it's a matter of, do you think it's a concrete idea or an abstract idea? You see the Rorschach test thing, right?
Yeah. Right. Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I've always wondered, maybe I'm way off here, on vanity, is there anything about a sense of being just self-absorbed that could apply there, that, you know, we are so self-absorbed, like a lot of us may stay in our head a lot and trying to get outside of our head, and that's with some of the Yahweh, the focusing on that, sometimes the mystical side uses that to try to get outside and be more open to kind of the experiential, the listening side of prayer.
So I think that fits in some cases. Again, the difficulty is when you look at all the instances of the use of the word Hevel throughout, sometimes that doesn't fit so well. So one of my favorite passages is chapter 8, verses 10 through 15. Let's see. Well, I'll do 14 through 15. There is a Hevel. I'm just giving you the Hebrew instead of translating it, okay? There's a Hevel that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people who are treated according to the acts of the wicked, and there are wicked people who are treated according to the acts of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity. So I commend enjoyment. For there is nothing better for people under the sun than to eat and drink and enjoy themselves, for this will go with them in their toil through the days of life that God gives them under the sun. So it's so interesting because we have Hevel. This is 8:14 through 15. We have Hevel, and then we have the righteous. This is beautiful poetry. actually, because of the mirror structure, treated according to the acts of the wicked. And there are wicked who are treated according to the acts of the righteous. This also is Hevel. So we have two really important and interesting features of Hebrew poetry being used here. One is called inclusio, which is where you begin and end with the same thing, kind of an envelope structure. And the other one we have is chiasm, where you do a dot to dot here, and you get the Greek letter chi, which looks like an X to us. So it's a beautiful little poetic verse. Plus, as some of you were speaking up, we can feel this. There are righteous people who are treated according to the acts of the wicked. Do you have an example in mind? And there are wicked people who are treated according to the acts of the righteous. Okay? I mean, that preaches without me saying anything, doesn't it? Yeah, it's all in your head because you know it. So there's some very deep truth in this, and then Hevel on both sides, enclosing it. And then at the end, this recourse to carpe diem. What does that mean here? Is this, well, celebrate life, or is it what the hell, or is it stress eating? You know, is it distraction? Is it kind of a ostrich deal, burying your head in the sand or in the food? But maybe both and. Well, and the other thing that I really struggled a lot with when I was writing on this is in terms of the righteous being treated according to the acts of the wicked, you know, and my students will often point this out, carpe diem is easy for someone to say who's wealthy or at least has of means, but what about all the people who don't have the luxury of eat and drink and enjoy your life, or their whole job, their whole life is truly forced providing for other people's carpe diem?
Don't we also, it's also, couldn't some be understood as living in the present? Because the present's all we have. We can't totally live in the past or the future, too. So I could see some wisdom kind of being seized there. Is like, well, you only have this moment, so you might as well live it to the max, because that, you know, tomorrow's not guaranteed.
That is true, and Kohelet says almost just that. But and you reminded me, there's a great book that Marcus Borg wrote called "Reading the Bible Again for the First Time." Have any of you read that? It's a fantastic book. And in his section on Ecclesiastes, he says he thinks there are 3 ways to think about this book. Again, the Rorschach test thing, right? And he said, read chapter 3, 1 through 8, the poem, which I would say read 3, 1 through 15 so that you can get the commentary on the poem, or the whole chapter 3. And then first imagine it as the birds' song, singing it, and that kind of upbeat, groovy way of portraying that passage. Then next, think of a German Lutheran pastor reading that passage in monotone, depicted in an Ingmar Bergman film, all black and white, in a cold, snowy scene in a little wooden church on the upper Midwest plains. And you can hear the wind coming through the windows, and you can feel the uncomfortable wooden pews, and people are sitting there all bundled up. And so that's another way of reading that chapter. But the third one, which connects to what you were saying, was he says, imagine the Dalai Lama reading it. And when I originally started on this project, a colleague of mine, Harold Washington, who used to teach at St. Paul, he and I were working on the project together. We started working on the project together, and he has a much more Buddhist view of the book. I tend to have the more cynical view of the book. So, if it's a Rorschach test, I guess that's what I just told you about myself. So, but anyway, I think anytime I try to nail down what does Hevel mean in Kohelet, I try to look at 8, 14, and 15 and think of that. But there are so many examples throughout the book of the different ways that the word is used. So my favorite advice for how to proceed, given this dilemma, is to read the book and just every time you see whatever word your translation is using, vanity is the most common one, just substitute Hevel. I mean, if you're not against it, mark it out. And then let the context tell you what the word means. I'll tell you the best way that this ever worked for me was I have a friend in Oklahoma City who's a playwright and a director, a thespian, and when his dad died, he found some comfort in Kohelet, in Ecclesiastes. And so he turned it into a play. So he does a whole monologue of Ecclesiastes, and the title of the play is Meaningless. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, yeah.
With the use of vanity, one meaning that I don't think you covered was like vanity in vain vanity, the uselessness, not necessarily selfishness or a piece of furniture. So is that the view more here in this book?
Yeah, I think the meaning of if we were to look at dictionary definitions of the word vanity, the one that means, I think you said uselessness. Yeah, I think that's what the translators are working with in using vanity here.
But it's kind of a little bit different nuance than uselessness.
Yeah.
Because it's like you can rail against this, but it's really not going to make any difference.
Yeah, that seems to be where this author is. You can rail against it, but it seems to not make any difference. To me, that's one of the things I really struggle about with the book, is I think that a sole focus on this book could really encourage us to give up and make us complacent. It doesn't have a whole lot of motivation for being activists or change agents or advocates. That's where I'm glad the book is part of a larger canon.
Well, one thing that I was thinking about, I never have been able to find this in writing, or that I had a professor at OU one time that he thought of creation being God creating this ship with people on it and then letting it go and then just like throwing up his hands.
Uh-huh.
And just from your talking and not having read this, I kind of wonder too about, we kind of attribute a lot of control to God, that like, well, God's will be done, God's will be done. But when we do that kind of thing, we forget, well, God gave us free will. And so you can't have it both ways, but I find Christianity, especially popular Christianity, kind of says, well, God will take care of everything. No, God won't take care of everything. We have free will. We have the ability to do something. So I don't know if that works.
No, those are great theological questions. And as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the most important reasons for us to engage with this book is because it throws a wrench in some of our theological views. So I encourage you to all go to the book and ask yourselves, what does this book say about God? what does this author think that God is like? I'm guessing this author might have quite a different view of God than you do. That's okay. For some people, that's a really new way to think about the Bible. For others of you, that might be old hat. But so I really encourage you to think about that. How is God described here? And does that, and in what ways does that come into some tension with my own theology? Or with, as you said, contemporary Christian theology? Go ahead.
Well, part of it, I think, is really learning. I think the wisdom tradition might suggest that learning to live with contradiction, with paradox, and usually what the first step of wisdom is realizing how much you don't know.
Yes.
So the Sophia part of that, and when you talked about the Buddhist thing, the Dalai Lama, I always liked the quote that is attributed to him. Like, learn the rules very well, so that when you're more mature, and we kind of see this in Jesus, you know how to break them properly, so that you don't become overly rigid. So it's a more of a faith development sort of perspective.
No, that's right. And I think that what we see in Kohelet is kind of that more mature wisdom literature that is asking the questions. I'm always encouraging my students to ask the questions. So here's this is just a list of the Carpe Diems. And you'll see them as you go through. Oh, did you have a comment? Go ahead.
Yeah, something you said made me think I need to look at the cultural context for that. Warren Carter has made the comment that Revelation was a guidebook on how to survive under the Roman oppression.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm wondering how this
Good. That's a
relates to
great
that.
question, and I'm a fan of Warren Carter, and I teach Revelation that way. Part of the problem is we don't know for sure. The book is not, as I said, I tend to date the book to about 250 BCE. So it's Greek rule of Judea. At that time, it probably wasn't overly oppressive Greek rule, but it wasn't real friendly either. And so it's hard to know. I mean, Revelation, it's pretty easy to see all the horrible stuff that the Romans are doing to the Christians. That's blatant. We don't see that so much here. So the commentaries vary a lot on the assumptions that they make. So unfortunately, what scholars are in the position of doing is saying, well, I think this book is from 250 BCE in which this was going on, and so we think that in terms of, for instance, economics or social structure. And other scholars say, oh, I think this book is from 250 years earlier than that, and around 500 BCE, in which case we know X, Y, and Z about the social structure and economics. But in both cases, what we know is not as much as we know about the Greco-Roman period, the time of Revelation. So, and this is often the case in studying the Hebrew Bible, is we just don't have as much information. So, I would say most scholars agree that there was some social stratification, that Kohelet either was part of a higher social strata or portraying that for cynical reasons, maybe even a satire on a person from that strata. That's something that I entertain a little bit, but unfortunately we don't know too well. Sorry. An answer I often give. Here's a piece of art from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. A vanitas is a genre of art, if you didn't know. There you go. That portrays objects that connote mortality in various ways. I cannot explain in what way all of these objects, each of these objects, portrays mortality. Some of them are rather obvious, as in the skull and the bones. We've got this kind of thinker not the thinker, but this may be self-reflection, or maybe he's pulling a thorn out of his foot there. I'm not sure. We've got the armor, the musical instruments. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but this is a whole genre. And then there's also, if you go to the Bible Odyssey website, which I always like to plug this website, not just because I have an article on there, but because I always find that people are looking for good quality biblical information online. There's a lot of very poor quality biblical information online. You might have noticed. Bible Odyssey is the website of the Society of Biblical Literature. And so scholars write all of these articles, and you can even write in a question, ask a scholar. There's a lot of good stuff on here. Unfortunately, it's not fully funded, and so there are ads. Do not click on them. So I wrote a piece on Vanity of Vanities for Bible Odyssey, and so there they used another Vanitas illustration as well.
Tracy thinks the music piece, you have to be alive to enjoy music. So that's what she thinks that means with the music.
Because as our mortality, that's why we can enjoy music or the arts. Just enjoyment, that's all you can. So you have to be alive.
I like that. Are you an art historian? No. Okay, well, I'll take it anyway. Just a librarian? No such thing as just a librarian. Okay, so I talked about this already, and we're almost out of time, so I'm not going to go over this in depth, but I want to introduce this to you. One of the things that you need to know about, I think, strongly, in order to really understand what's going on in Kohelet, especially in terms of our scavenger hunt, where are the women hiding? Remember, this is your job, is we have to know about woman wisdom. So in the book of Proverbs, we have two literary personifications. We're pulling out your high school AP vocab here, right? Two literary personifications, both are female. One is woman wisdom. She cries out, she has her say, and she asks the people, how long will you love your naivete and hate knowledge? So wisdom is portrayed as a woman, and perhaps would have aligned with some of the goddess figures of the ancient world. Perhaps was used in a assumed heteronormative classroom with young men to help them pay attention. You know, here is the woman that you want to follow. As opposed to, I'll get to the other one, then you've got to read Proverbs 8. If you don't know this chapter, this is huge. I actually had a student not long ago who wrote a paper called The Quadrinity of God, suggesting that the Trinity should be supplemented by woman wisdom. So in Proverbs 8, we find woman wisdom is with God at creation. So if you haven't read Proverbs 8, please do. But the second female personification in Proverbs is, she has various titles: the strange woman, the foreign woman, woman folly. All too often she is called adulteress, which is not a fair translation in almost every case. So I have NRSV here. You can see I adjusted it a little bit with the square brackets. The CEB, the Common English Bible, I think is the one that I like on these passages. So, I mean, look, her lips drip honey, but her speech is smoother than oil, but she's bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. So you can, again, to that classroom setting, okay, boys, this is the woman you want to follow, and this is the one to avoid. But they're ways of teaching wisdom. They're abstract concepts of wisdom and folly. Again, her way leads down to death. Also, I think it's in chapter 5 or 6, there's this great passage that talks about she will capture you with her eyelashes, which I find truly marvelous. So familiarize yourself at least with, it's the first 9 chapters of Proverbs, and that'll really help as you do our task. So here's your task. Find the women hiding in Kohelet. Keep notes. Somebody keep notes for the class so that when we reconvene in 3 weeks, you can tell me what you find. And so here's our schedule. So next week you're going to do 1:1 through 7:14. So you can read that before you come and discuss. And keep notes. What were your questions? Where did you find some women hiding? And then week 3, you're going to do the second half of the book, 7:15 to 12:14. Again, where are the women hiding? What questions do you have? And then when I join you on Zoom on week 4, it's Ollie Ollie Income Free at the end of the hide and seek game. And I'll hear what you thought, and you'll hear what I thought, and we'll have a fun conversation. Any questions? Does that sound good? Okay, fantastic. Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Okay. That's cool. Well, it's interesting as you said that too. It made me think of that literal meaning of hevel and breath. And I was a flute player, so the way that is fleeting. So yeah, that's good. Thank you. Cool. Awesome. All right. Thanks, everybody.
See, I'm not the only one who gives you homework. Dr. Wolf did too.